Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder. And today we're going to talk about the social issues of the 1950s and how everything wasn't always roses and rainbows for everybody. And this will finish up our topic over the 1950s. So, a lot of people prospered in the 1950s, but not everybody. A lot of people felt left out. Others, who had even obtained more wealth during the 1950s, wondered whether all of these material things really led to a better quality of life. These discontents of the 1950s are going to be the seeds that are sowed for the first signs of dissent in the hippie movement and the counterculture of the 1960s. So minorities, especially in the 1950s, don't have the same access to this suburban 1950s lifestyle that whites do. Critics even object to this conformity of this mass culture and consumerism of everybody buying the same things and watching the same shows and listening to the same music and driving the same cars and owning the same house. Americans, did they sacrifice their individualism to fit into a larger community? Are we no longer individuals? And yes, they would agree that material conditions have improved, but just because we have lots of things does not mean the quality of life has improved. They also criticized the amount of advertising taking place that molded the tastes of the public. Writers during this time lament the lifestyle of the 1950s. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit is a bestseller about a soldier who comes back from World War II and can't find any meaning in life. Catcher in the Rye is a popular book among teenagers, and The Feminine Mystique, although not published until 1963, really starts the women's movement because women are forced to be homemakers, and a lot of them believe that they have more to offer than just being a homemaker. And beatniks are the people who reject this middle-class lifestyle. It's a group of writers and artists who refuse to conform to the accepted American ways of the 1950s of dressing, thinking, and acting in American life. And they would write poems like Allen Ginsberg's Howl, or the Rebel Without a Cause movie with James Dean. A lot of Hollywood basically put the rebel into a movie form for people to watch, and it was extremely popular. So not everybody is for the 1950s. Rock and roll becomes a youth symbol of the culture of the 1950s. It originates in the rhythm and blues traditions of African American music. A lot of white people weren't exposed to this in the South because of Jim Crow laws, but as blacks move north and migrate north to larger cities, they bring their music with them and expose it to white music, or to whites, basically. Elvis Presley lives in Memphis, and he listens to African-American radio stations and incorporates these gospel-type songs into his music, and once he is discovered, it sets off the enormous popularity of rock and roll music. Other artists of the time include Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Little Richard, and Ray Charles. And this inspires other bands coming over from England, such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Adults, most of them do not like this music. Ministers don't like it because of the passion that it can put into young people. When Elvis was on the Ed Sullivan Show, Ed Sullivan only allowed him to be filmed from the waist up because his gyrating hips and tight pants could give teenage girls bad ideas. And Congress even held hearings on the subversive nature of rock music. So it is controversial, but it was a symbol of youth culture of the 1950s, and it will become a way to express oneself moving forward into the 1960s. Poverty in the 50s. Michael Harrington writes a best-selling book called The Other America and claims that poverty, even though we're not seeing it, it is widespread in the United States. He claims upwards of 50 million people live in urban and rural poverty. Urban, what's happening, whites move from the city to the suburbs. They also take their taxes for city services with them. So this happened kind of akin to what happened in Detroit a few years ago when Detroit went bankrupt and a lot of people moved away from Detroit. because the car companies weren't doing so hot. It basically made Detroit a terrible place to live. And now the inner city refers to the most central part of the oldest part of the city, where minorities live in poor, crowded neighborhoods that are plagued with crime, also inadequate housing and schools. And the whites move out to the suburbs. Some people refer to this as white flight. Urban renewal projects were started by federal, state, and local governments that try to get rid of these old places and build freeways in their place and developments, newer businesses that should revitalize downtown areas. But it often backfired by driving poor people to even poorer areas. And so we're concentrating poverty even more. And that's what happens with public housing. New public housing is built that's government subsidized, so it's cheap. It has great utilities, but it also concentrates poor people into one place, which leads to other problems such as crime once again. Rural farming, what's going on in the rural areas is it's shifting from small family-owned farms to corporations farming and large-scale farmings. And some farmers leave these rural areas and relocate to the city with the other poor people. Most farmers stay behind and wonder, if it's going to be their turn to prosper soon, but it never comes. And minorities suffer during the 1950s as well. Puerto Ricans immigrating to New York City are forced to live in the poorest inner city parts, and since a lot of them don't speak English, they don't have any political power to get help from the city to improve even the most basic services like trash removal and other stuff like that. Mexicans, remember the Bracero program during World War II, it brought Mexicans here to work farms during World War II because all of the men were gone. The Braceros were looked down upon, cheated, and exploited by their employers. And if they complain, they would be deported back to Mexico, so they don't feel like they can say anything about it. One politician even called it legalized slavery. And Native Americans, in the 1950s, the government enacts the termination policy, which seeks to end tribal governments and Indian tribes and relocate them to cities. So the goal is to assimilate Indians into American society, which really hasn't ever worked, so why would it work now? But it only made things worse for them. So things were not all peachy keen for everybody in the 1950s. And if you fill out your learning targets, bring them back. We'll talk more about this in class, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.